okay, into it. So, what do we remember from here? English, Indian English is different, okay, if we look closely at it. Indian English is different from English in India. It was not that the use or the introduction of English in India came about only in the 18th century or in the 19th century. Heinrich Mario Nin, in his book English in India, points to the date 1600. In fact, the last day of 1600, and says that the granting by the crown of England of the charter to the merchants to deal with the East and eventually the East India Company, it really should be the correct date, okay, to talk about the beginnings of English in India, of the English language in India. Okay. So, 1600 is the date that is set by Mario Nin and many scholars, if at all we are to point to the coming, so to speak, of English in India. Okay. So, it came with once the charter was granted, so it came with the company. Now, let us go back again to Braj Kachru and let us look at how he talks about the 4 stages, okay, of the language in India, and he says that the 4 stages are these. First, when we talk about how English came into India, we have to refer to the missionary efforts. Okay? We need to refer to the Christian missionaries, right, who on their evangelical mission, okay, also used also brought the Christian ideals and the Christian texts. Okay. So, the first stage, Kachru says, is the stage of exploration, and this stage of exploration was largely by the missionary and their efforts. It is also it is also followed, the missionary effort was also followed by the missionaries themselves to learn the native languages. It is an error to think that the Christian missionaries only brought the they sought to spread the English language here. After a certain time, they realized that if in their zeal, in their evangelistic zeal, if they did not learn the native languages themselves, then it would be, after a point of time, well near impossible to spread Christianity. I can give you an example from Assam, for instance. Okay, it is said that the first Assamese dictionary was by Miles Bronson, who was a Baptist missionary, okay, who came to spread Christianity in Assam. So, the very first dictionary of the Assamese language in the northeastern part of India was not by a native, was in fact by by Miles Bronson and his colleagues, who very successfully brought out the the first Assamese dictionary. Okay. So, it is really, as I said, the exploratory part, as Professor Kachru says, the exploratory part must be it must be realized that the Christian missionaries were responsible, okay, for bringing in English and later on to switching, so as it were, to the native languages. Then Kachru says that the next phase is the phase of implementation. Right. In the phase of implementation, he famously refers to Macaulay's Minute on Education. Macaulay's Minute on Education that was submitted to the government was is considered a famous or an infamous, if you will, minute on education, where he laid out the policies and the strategies behind the need for English education, to cultivate, as he calls, a group of people who would be Indian in color, but in taste they were to be raised as Englishmen. The idea here was to introduce the English language as well as into education, as well as create a class of people who were called the Babus, for instance, who would play important part at the clerical level, okay, in British administration. So, they would then need to be trained in the English language and in certain values of Christianity and Western life. So, the third phase, as mentioned by Professor Kachru, is a phase of diffusion, where he says that the British control was paramount, and the diffusion of English language grew to a great extent during this time. And finally, is the implementation, okay, the implementation of all the educational strategies and policies that were hitherto being forwarded by various by various bureaucrats in the British government. Okay. So, what then are the 4 stages? The 4 stages are A, the exploratory stage, beginning with the missionaries. Then was the phase of implementation, coming with Macaulay's famous minute of 1835, followed by the phase of diffusion of British control, and finally of implementation of their policies. So, this is how the beginning and growth of English in India is to be seen along with socio-political and evangelist developments. Okay. Now, a very important scholar here in the delineation of English studies, really, of the political imperatives behind English in India, has been a scholar named Gauri Vishwanathan. Now, some of you may be aware, or the name may be familiar to you, particularly her doctoral dissertation, I think, which went on to be published as Masks of Conquest. Okay. So, Gauri Vishwanathan's book is one that I would recommend to you, okay, to be read if you really have to understand the policies and strategies behind the introduction, in this case, of not just the English language, but of the literary study in India. Okay. Now, you would be surprised to know, if you do not know already, that the study of literature, okay, as a discipline was or the study of English literature as a discipline was not something that was not something that began in England. Okay. The study of rhetoric was very important at the universities of say Cambridge, for instance. Okay. The study of philology, the study of language, the study of rhetoric, these were the disciplines that were being taught. Okay. Surprisingly, English literature as a discipline was introduced in India first before it was introduced in England. So, one may raise this question, what was the need? Okay, what is this anomaly here that the literature of a certain country is first taught or first forwarded as part of the curriculum, okay, in a colonized country, right. So, Vishwanathan very beautifully, very successfully brings out what was behind the scenes, okay, or what the policies were of these. And I am now going to quickly read from Masks of Conquest, and the theoretical impetus comes from the concept of hegemony that was given to us by the Italian Marxist scholar Antonio Gramsci. Okay. Hegemony is according to Gramsci not something that is necessarily imposed on us. Okay. Hegemony is something that the person on whom it is imposed may also very willingly adhere to. Okay. So, she says here, cultural domination works by consent. Now, this is the important point. Okay. So, domination is usually understood as an act of power, an act of coercion. Okay. So, following Gramsci, Vishwanathan says that cultural domination does not have to be only one of power, an act of power. Cultural domination works by consent and can and often does precede conquest by force. Power operating concurrently at two clearly distinguishable levels produces a situation, and she refers to Gramsci here, where Gramsci writes, the supremacy of a social group manifests itself in two ways, as domination and as intellectual and moral leadership. Okay, so there are two sides to hegemony. One is the usually understood in the usually understood sense of domination, but also in the guise of leadership, of intellectual and particularly moral leadership. This hegemony may in fact be consented to, okay, by those who are dominated, because it is seen as something that is desirable. In fact, because it is a desire sometimes even created, okay, by those in power as something that is to be desired by the population. Okay. So, let me again read this. Cultural domination works by consent and can and often does precede conquest by force. Power operating concurrently at two clearly distinguishable levels produces a situation where, Gramsci writes, the supremacy of a social group manifests itself in two ways: as domination and as intellectual and moral leadership. It seems clear that there can and indeed must be hegemonic activity even before the rise to power, because there has to be a level of consent, okay, rise to power, and that one should not count only on the material force which power gives in order to exercise an effective leadership. Okay, so, this is precisely what according to Gauri Vishwanathan happened in India. It was not an act of power, but it was also a leadership projected as something that would give one intellectual and moral upliftment. Okay. So, therefore, English was used to as some as a tool, or English and English literary study was used as a tool. So, as Vishwanathan says, to mask colonial exploitation. Okay. So, in the name of providing a quote unquote better education, okay, to the native population in India, okay, what was going on was actually colonial exploitation. And the second point is in the name of stability, right. So, the two, one is giving you enlightenment, okay, and the second is creating a veneer, so to speak, of stability, and not just creating a veneer of stability, I should say, also to ensure administrative stability. Okay. So, these were the two things: one, masking, according to Gauri Vishwanathan, masking colonial exploitation, and the other is to provide administrative stability in India, for which the English language and English literature in particular was seen as highly desirable. Do you follow? Next, if you look at the words of Macaulay, and I had referred to to the strategies of behind the introduction of English in India, English studies. Macaulay says that we need to create a class, this is from his famous minute, we need to create a class who may be, that is a class from Indians, we need to create a class who may be interpreters between us and those whom we govern. A class of persons, it says, Indians in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinion, in morals and in intellect. So, it was a very clear agenda really, that there would be a class created from educated Indians, okay, who would be the go between, so to speak. Okay. They would be interpreters between the British government and the native Indian. They would be interpreters, and even though they were they were Indian in blood, they would really be sahibs, or the brown sahibs as you know they were called, okay, whose taste would be formed, whose intellectual moral taste would be so formed, so that they are attuned, okay, they are attuned to English values and English culture. Okay. So, this as Vishwanathan and several other scholars have pointed out, that this was a deliberate attempt and a deliberate strategy in the history of English in India. As scholars have pointed out, there were really, you could clearly see two stages, okay, you could clearly see two stages in the subject matter, so to speak, okay, of English in India. Now, one period is from 1830 to 1850, okay, and the impetus here was on clearly on Christian imagery. Okay, this was the time when, as we noticed, the missionaries were encouraged. Okay, so the impetus was on teaching Christian imagery through Christian texts, right, and a general English, to sort of to celebrate English ideals and English standards, right. So, this was the first phase of first phase behind introducing English as a language and English literary studies in India. That was of trying to show the Christian religion as a religion that was better than, there are so many tracts really, if you look at that would deride Hinduism, call it a superstitious superstitious religion, for instance, and Hindus as steeped in superstition. So, in the first phase we found that Christian imagery was used a lot, okay, and English ideas in general. But what happened was, from 1950 onwards, was realized that the missionaries the proselytizing done by the missionaries were being resisted by the Indian population, okay, in many pockets, and it was seen as not really no more a desirable thing to do. In many books, for instance, in many history books on the history of missionaries in northeastern part of India, you will also find when you look at the exchanges, okay, of documents or official documents between the missionaries and the British government, you will be surprised to find that there are a number of times they have been they have been almost at loggerheads with one another. Okay, one trying to say that it was important to proselytize, it was important to convert the population to Christianity, and the other putting a stop to it and saying that it was inimical or sometimes at odds with government policy. Okay. So, then from 1850 onwards, we see that impetus is more secular, okay, than Christian. So, the stance here of English in India was by the British government was secular in nature, and where was the focus? The focus was on commerce. Okay? The focus was on commerce, commercial and administrative goals, right. So, movement away from Christian ideals, of English ideals, of texts to do with Christianity and Christian imagery, to a desire to educate the Indians in matters commercial and administrative. So, this is a clear policy change that we find in the history of English in India. Referring again quickly to Macaulay is how many of the British saw their literature as being far above the literatures of India. For instance, Macaulay, for instance, is famously known to have said that, and I quote him, "I have never found one amongst them who could deny that a single shelf of European library was worth the whole native literature of Asia and Arabia." So, it was again not really, it was not just by a matter of strategy and policy, it was also sought, it was also thought to be so by the British themselves, and it is also part of their goal to show to the Indians that the books or the literatures, the cultural ideals of the British were far better and superior than those of India. Therefore, if we may say that English was introduced in India as a tool first of civilization, a tool of light, a tool of enlightenment. English was used as a medium for understanding science and technology, and also the industrial revolution's technological impact, okay, was also one of the points that we cannot ignore here. Okay, so the entire, if you look at it, the whole picture that was created was, as you said, India was not civilized and hence had to be civilized with first Christian and then later on science and technology, ideals of science and technology, and the fruits of the industrial revolution. Okay. So, we also have here, following the same idea, a few words by Charles Grant, for instance, okay, who said that the true curse of darkness is the introduction of light. The Hindus err because they are ignorant, and their errors have never fairly been laid before them. The communication of our light and knowledge to them would prove the best remedy for their disorders. These are some of, as I said, from Macaulay, Charles Grant, etc. These are some of the ways in which they had expressed this point. In Sri Lanka, then Ceylon also in 1827, we find Sir Edward Barnes, who laid the foundation of a Christian institution, saying this: to give a superior education to a number of young persons who from their ability, piety and good conduct were likely to prove fit persons in communicating a knowledge of Christianity to their countrymen. And if you look at other, the history of other colonized places, then this, a similar kind of history would definitely also emanate. Okay, again the history of enlightenment, a history of you say commercial and administrative gains, for instance, behind the spread of a language. Okay. Now, the English, reading from Gauri Vishwanathan, the English education of 1835 proposed by Governor General William Bentinck on Macaulay's advice made England, this is very important, 1835, a date that we had mentioned ago was the implementation phase, was that the English education, remember this, the English Education Act, okay, made English the medium of instruction in Indian education. This is 1835, an important date here. With the formal institutionalization of English as a language of instruction, the stage was set for a new direction to Indian education. Okay. But as the next chapter, that is in Vishwanathan's book, will elaborate, Bentinck's resolution was not as revolutionary in the introduction of a new language. The English language was already being taught in India even before 1835 as in endorsing a new function. Okay. So, it was new in the sense that it endorsed a new function and purpose for English instruction in the dissemination of moral and religious values. Okay. So, this is one of the points that has been highlighted by the author. Further again, she says, the history of education in British India shows that certain humanistic functions traditionally associated with literature, for example, the shaping of character or the development of the aesthetic sense or the disciplines of ethical thinking, were considered essential to the processes of socio-political control by the guardians of the same tradition. Okay. So, along with the fact that language had to be used, the language had to be interpreted by the local population. There were these other ideals, as mentioned here clearly, which is, it was shown as if English and English education would help the native to shape character. Okay. If one was seen as, or one was told that one was superstitious, one was one was in darkness and in need of enlightenment, it also showed that the portraiture was such that an English education would help you to shape your character, okay, your personality. Also then it will help you develop the aesthetic sense, they help you understand, it help you understand the beautiful, the sublime and the good, for instance. Okay. Further, the disciplines of ethical thinking, that it also make you an ethical person. So, if this was the projection, it was quite readily taken in by many from the educated middle class. So, English was sought to be, as even it is today, English was sought to be sort of the passport, okay, to higher development of oneself and higher moral and aesthetic ideal that one should aim at. Okay. Then she says, the tension between increasing involvement in Indian education and enforced non-interference in religion was productively resolved through the introduction of English literature. Okay. Significantly, the direction to this solution was present in the charter itself, one of whose section empowered the Governor General in Council to direct that a sum of not less than 1 lakh of rupees shall be annually applied to the revival and improvement, this is the revival and improvement of the teaching, of English literature in India and to the encouragement of the learned natives of India. Okay. Those of you who are in literary studies would also know that one of the opinions of writers is that literature is a literary text is one which you read not just for pleasure. Okay. Good literary text is supposed to also give you certain values, right, and through the certain positive characteristics, for instance, of say the protagonist, for instance, or certain undesirable traits in, for instance, again in certain undesirable qualities in the villain, for instance. So, these literary texts are not just texts from which you learn the language or which you just enjoy reading. Okay. You also inculcate, and many studies in in cognitive studies of literary perception also do reveal that, okay, that a reader is sometimes finds herself, okay, emulating the characteristics. So, what better way to sort of tutor the Indian mind in certain ideals, okay, than to introduce English literary texts. This is one of the reasons, as we as we mentioned earlier ago, why English literature as a discipline came in the colonies first rather than in the mother country. Then Vishwanathan says, increasingly there was less patience with the policy of conciliation. The initial wave of euphoria over the literary treasures of India, rapturously described as so new, so fresh, so original, so unlike all the antiquated types and models of the West, with which the mind was aroused and enraptured, had by the 1820s given way to caustic criticisms of its systems of learning. Minto's minute, this is talking about an earlier history, minute of 1813 favoring the revival of Oriental learning was harshly criticized for not making the slightest effort to introduce in whole or part by implantation or engraftment the improved literature and science of Europe, embodying as these do all that is magnificent in discovery, ennobling and in truth, and elevating in sentiment. Okay. So, it seems that when, like in many cases, when the British first came in contact with the literatures of the Orient, say literature in India, they obviously they found such literature exotic. Okay, they found the many differences in ideals, the many differences in the way of expression as something that was very appealing at first. Okay, so this very appeal of the Indian text to the British was later on discouraged, and these texts were shown to be inferior to Western texts. Okay, not perhaps only because they really saw it as inferior, but also because it was at odds with the policy of introducing English. Okay. So, I will end this lecture by again coming back to Professor Braj Kachru and referring back again to our lecture on the alchemy of English. Okay. This has been a history, a history of English in India has been a history of political management, okay, of hegemony, as we saw through Gauri Vishwanathan, of hegemonic impulses not by coercion, but by the creation and manufacture of consent. What is its status today? Okay. The status today, as we saw in the lecture on the alchemy of English, is that is really that English has created a new caste, if you may use the word here by analogy. English has created a new caste of people who in India who are enjoying the fruits of a modern technological world. Okay. On the other hand, the language, by its sheer attitudinal neutrality, okay, can also erase certain markers of oppression, of inequality. For instance, certain markers of caste that are present in Indian languages are not there in English. Okay. So, English can be a great leveler today in India. Okay. And at the same time, as it also creates a particular, a very privileged class, or as Kachru says, a caste of people, right, who enjoyed the fruits of liberalization and modernization. So, in the alchemy of English, if you recall, Kachru had said that competence in English and the use of this language signify a transmutation like alchemy and added potential for material and social gain and advantage, which is really available to face it, okay, as Kachru says, available to a very few. Knowing English is like possessing the fabled Aladdin's lamp, which permits one to open, as it were, the linguistic gates to international business, technology, science and travel, and this is precisely what is happening in India today. Even as we speak right now, the percentage of population total population in India that knows English and reaps the benefits of knowing English is enormously low. Okay. So, this has created a disparity among the population itself. Okay. So, this is something that we need to even as we celebrate, okay, the use and the great potential of the language, okay, to take us very far, particularly in the international scenario, we have to understand the other side as well. Okay. This also, Kachru says, has created, as we saw in that lecture, created a sort of linguistic schizophrenia. Okay. What is this linguistic schizophrenia that is still present in contemporary India that he talks about is that in anti-English circles, we find surprisingly that there is one policy inside the home and another outside. This is linguistic schizophrenia in case of English. You will often find, as Kachru said, many even policy makers or many public figures in their public speeches talking about the need, okay, for us to learn in the vernacular language, okay, to send our children to schools where the medium of instruction is in the native language. But on the other hand, if it is to be believed so, these very personalities do not hesitate to send their own children, okay, as Kachru puts it, to English medium schools or to places of higher education in the European or American world, or okay, the Western world in general. So, there is also this kind of linguistic split in the country. So, this has created, as he says, a new caste of English using speech fellowships across cultures and usage, a shift of power from the traditional class structures of India and a new caste has developed, an important social change giving users power for mobility and social advancement. Fine. And I would like to end this discussion today by referring to a well-known writer named Raja Rao, the author of the famous Kanthapura, who says that as long as the English language is universal, it will always remain Indian. We shall have the English language with us and amongst us, and not as our guest or friend, but as one of, as he says, as one of our own, of our caste, our creed, our sect and our tradition. This obviously would again take us back to to a lecture like World Englishes, for instance, okay, where we have our own variant of English. English is here, as Rajarao says, in our country no longer as a guest, no longer as a hitherto colonial tool of masked exploitation and commercial administrative advantages. Okay. English has been Indianized, as many would say. English has been Indianized, and we see this in the many creative and linguistic, so to speak, experimentation that has been done by poets writing in India, writing in English, by novelists, as I mentioned earlier, Arundhati Roy, for instance, in The God of Small Things, and many other writers who have created a specific kind of English which is no longer English, but is Indian English. Okay? And thank you for being with us. See you in the next module. Thank you.